Our weekly Monday evening class. And I'm it's a joy to be with you again this week. I was just telling Bara here, it's in the United States where I'm, Ananda Village, where I'm broadcasting from. It's snowing outside, which is actually quite a nice thing because it brings a very peaceful atmosphere, at least for the moment, until you start trying to drive on the snow. But today, I wanted to talk about what I find to be an interesting subject. And I'd like to begin by just mentioning that here we are in the 21st century now, but we're coming out of an age where spirituality has somewhat been defined by outward things. And there's some truth to these outward things, but we come out of an age and where the true renunciate or the quote unquote true renunciate is someone who has renounced outward modes, you might say, engagement in the world, career, family, and possessions, outward possessions. It's a renunciation. When we say renunciation, we think of those things outwardly. But we've now moved into an age where sometimes those things are not quite, they're subtle, and they always have been subtle. But now, more in an age of energy that we live in a modern world, one can't quite express some of those aspects quite as starkly, perhaps, as in ages past. And I'd like to speak to one of those. And now, one of a collection of them. Historically, if you wanted to be a renunciate, either whether East or West, in the monastic tradition of the West, you renounce certain things, and it was a given. And for example, there was the three great temptations, and the monk was enjoined to overcome. Colloquially, it would be say wine, women, and gold. And in even you read Ramakrishna's biography, and this would be in India, of course, in Bengal, he would when somebody would drift away from the spiritual quest, Ramakrishna over and over again in his biographies, he would say, "Ah, yes, women in gold, women in gold." Now, of course, that's a little bit unfair to women. And it's probably unfair to gold too, because that's not what the problem was. And if you go back to the uh, Bible, I believe it was St. Paul that says the root of all evil is money, money being the root of all evil. But that's not actually the correct quote. It was the desire for money is the root of all evil. And today I'd like to speak about one of those three elements, and that is money, and the desire for money, and the renunciation of money, and compare it to what Paramahansa Yogananda recommended. This was a better way to frame that would be uh, the desire for money instead of poverty, which has been promoted, and many saints they would promote that as a alternative to money. Saint Francis even spoke of it as he embraced Lady Poverty, and poverty in some monastic traditions became an ideal. And of course, in the East, in India, we think of the wandering sadhu, the person who has absolutely nothing, renounced, I renounced it all. And that has become the ideal also. And when we think of that renunciation, we think of the wandering sadhu, and we have something, we have these possessions, and if we have family, we think, oh, that's somehow a lower caliber. We can't be a true yogi unless we give all of that up, go off to the Himalayas and renounce. Well, is that really practical in today's age? For a few people, probably so. And even Master Paramahansa Yogananda, he recognized that. But he espoused a different ideal. Instead of poverty, he said, why don't we use the word simplicity? Because that embodies more of what's trying to be accomplished in life, simplicity versus poverty. And he actually didn't like, and as he expressed it to his disciples, he didn't like that word poverty because it gave a wrong connotation and it could be misinterpreted. And Swami spoke to this quite a bit because at Ananda village, when he started an ashram, here we were, most people were living, if not, if not in a state of poverty, certainly in a state of lack of gold, a lack of money, because most people were young. They hadn't, when they started here at Ananda village, they didn't have much resources. But it was okay because there was no actual desire for those things. People, were quite content with it. But he had come from a monastic tradition as being part of the monastery that Master had started at SRF. And he saw some of the limitations of it. And he wanted to imbue us with an ideal of renunciation, and that had to embrace the material side as well. And so he spoke about not poverty, but he said, Master always recommended simplicity and not an embrace of poverty. Now, why was that? And he would go back to this phrase, it's the desire for money, not money itself. It's the desire for these things of the world, sexual attraction, not necessarily a man or a woman. It's these things that are inside of ourselves that want to pull us out of our contentment within ourselves, and that we do need to have some modicum of control over those, but not through suppression, but rather through a rechanneling of the energy that was behind those. Now, money or gold, or you could say as it's symbolized, has an attraction, and there are realities to why the saints would say to be careful or to watch that, because it has a attraction. And if we look, what is it that money gives us? Well, you see, the thing about money is it increases this sense of power and importance that we have. A person has lots of money, and that somehow it reinforces the ego. It has that tendency, possessions, that now you interestingly find that many of Master's most advanced disciples were very wealthy businessmen, but they weren't particularly bound by it. They had been able, the money was part of their life, and they were brought up, or they had become successful, but it was the energy behind the money that made them successful. They had been able to accumulate energy and use energy, and it just happened to be that material wealth came with that, but they didn't have a particular attachment to it. And so consequently, this is why it's the love of money that is the problem. It's that attachment. And what money does breed in people is it breeds, it gives people there's a delight in being able to fulfill one's desires. And desires raise up, and if you have resources, material resources, you can fulfill this desire, you can fulfill that desires more easily. And so consequently, a desire by fulfilling it is never satisfied. They continually keep coming. And what happens? You find yourself enmeshed in a very complex world of material possessions, and you become habituated to it, you become attached to it, and you find that you cannot live without them. And so consequently, its habits begin to form, and you're hooked to it. Just like intoxicants, when they say wine, well, it's just and gold. Wine is just a symbol for an intoxicant, something artificial outside of oneself, giving one a high or a pleasure. and that can be alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be. But also, you could say that money itself, wealth becomes an intoxicant too, and we can just satisfy. They give that pleasure-inducing ability, but it also money has this tendency to uh, help us forget the source from which all of that which we need and our fulfillment comes. And instead of relying upon the divine source, we end up relying upon ourselves in the sense of the individual ego. So consequently, it suggests to the mind that I am the doer, and that, of course, too, is a problem, and attachment, of course, and a fulfillment of desires. Now, so what's wrong with that? If money, in other words, why not say, well, if I should try to get rid of all of those things? And yes, we should. And the means, perhaps we might think, is to abandon all those and live like St. Francis in a state of abject poverty with absolutely nothing, or a wandering sadhu that all he has is his loincloth and maybe a begging bowl. But Master said, well, it's very easy. You go up to the Ganges, up in the mountains, and you see the sadhus arguing over their loincloths, or their spot to be able to beg alms, or their favorite spot along the riverbank. He says they don't overcome anger necessarily just by renouncing outward possessions. That alone is not enough. You can still be attached no matter how much you have. If you have a little bit, you're still attached to it. And if you have a lot, so you are too. So money, being poor does not make one saintly. And oftentimes what's happened is there's this idealization of poverty. There's this romantic ideal that the poor of the salt are the salt of the earth, and by the nature of being poor, somehow they're more holy than the rich man who has lots of money. Well, it's true. Sometimes being poor, you are more saintly than a rich man, but it alone is not going to make you saintly. Being poor, and a rich man too can be a saintly person, and you find that poor people are not necessarily more saintly than anybody else. In fact, poverty itself has its problems in terms of spirituality. Makes one very, and you find actually spiritual aspirants, people who are seriously aspiring, and actually the lives of many who became saints, before they took up the spiritual path, they actually were usually not materially poor on the lower strata of economic in society. Interestingly, it was often they took up the spiritual path from a level of maybe not being prosperous, but they certainly had satisfaction, and they weren't on the lowest level of the economic scale. Interesting, because oftentimes when a person is very poor, their focus is on satisfying those material needs. And it's only after an ability is gained to satisfy those material needs that one comes to a realization that happiness does not lie there. And we get to the point, like Prince Siddhartha, who's a stark example of this. He gets to be into a wealthy position, and he realizes that wealth alone is not going to be enough. And so, it's a mistake to think just by being poor somehow I'm going to be virtuous, and that's not the case. Now, you can find poor people who are very virtuous, but probably they have learned these lessons at some point, and they may have very likely gotten to that point where they have embraced that life of simplicity. Paramahansa Yogananda had one of his neighbors in the desert where he had a very small retreat place where he could go in the desert to be alone and meditate more deeply, be quiet in the desert. He had a neighbor very close to his little house ashram there. His neighbor had a very simple place in the desert, and Master would point out to the monks. He says, "Look at that man. He's the king in his castle," because his neighbor, he would often, Master would often observe him in his very little simple house. He would be doing chores around the house, and he would be singing or whistling, and he had a very happy disposition going about his day, and he's the king in his castle. And his castle, of course, was a humble little cabin there, and he had a life of simplicity where he was no longer attached to those. And Master held this up as more of the ideal. Why not be simple in our life? And this is what he advised for us. And he didn't want to use the word poverty. Poverty, in Master's vocabulary, his understanding, and this is what Swami adopted too. He says poverty implies a sense of lack. In other words, this is something we want to, as individuals, overcome, the sense that we don't have enough. We don't have something. A consciousness of lack eats on the heart and drives us out to fill that emptiness of lack. And of course, we can never materially supply enough to ever overcome that sense of lack just by gathering things outside of ourselves. And often we are motivated when we seek something outside of ourselves by that emptiness, that sense of lack within ourselves. And that is what Master and Swamiji felt was the real definition of poverty. I don't have something. I'm discontent, you might say. And so that sense of lack that is expressed outwardly by a very non-possession carried to a high degree is something that might even be stimulated by depriving oneself outwardly. And so Master said, fulfill your needs and learn to understand the difference between what you need and what you want. And if you fill your needs and then concentrate on attaining a state of inner contentment, then you'll find that whatever one needs in life, somehow in a very mysterious way, it'll end up being supplied. And I saw this to be true that in Swami Kriyananda's life, that he was actually, he had come from a well-to-do family. They weren't wealthy, but they certainly were well off, enough to provide everything that Swami needed materially. And he came from that environment, but yet he embraced a life of monasticism, living in Paramahansa Yogananda's ashram. And he was perfectly content in both. He says he was absolutely content. He had a monthly allowance of $15, which in those days was more than $15 now, but it still was not very much. And he says he was perfectly content. But if he needed something, he said he could find a way to obtain it. He would do little projects, and money would come to him. And he was never, and his whole life, even later, when he really wanted something, money would float to him, but he was never attached to it. And the same thing Master said. He always had a bowl, a little jar, there was money there. And when he really needed it, he could put out energy, and Divine Mother would be able to supply that. And he said that's what we want to attain to, is that life of a simple life, which is what? How would we define simplicity? I think a good word is it's uncomplicated, and a simple life is not needy, satisfied with whatever God gives us, but at the same time, not to be passive. Now, this was one of the things that Swami Kriyananda, when he had come out of, when he created Ananda Village and his ashram that became Ananda Village, he had come from a monastic background, and he saw the limitations of some of the aspects of monasticism in terms of this ideal of non-possession. And because here in Ananda village, he wanted to create a community that included monastics, yes. He wanted also to be a single people who were not monastics. He wanted to create a community that would allow for families. And in today's day and age, you know, if you're going to raise children, it's very natural. You need to have necessities provided. You need to have a home. You needed to probably you're going to have a job and income production. And so he didn't want to stress this ideal of poverty. He said that was antithetical in the modern world. He said for a few people that might be possible to be totally embrace non-possession. You could go maybe off somewhere. He says, but even there, for most people, it's not necessarily healthy. And the reason his observation was, he says, for many people, they end up like the sadhu, they end up begging on the wayside. He said that's not a good thing to do because it's passive. Now, to see that everything in the highest sense, that everything comes from God, yes, there are individual cases where one can live that way, but for most people, it doesn't work. That sort of life leads to not dependence on God, but it leads to a dependence on other people and other situations that will allow your daily bread to be brought to you, and it destroys the lack of individual initiative. And both Swami and Master were firm on this, that the individual will of the devotee needs to be stimulated and one should never become passive. And to express that outwardly, to provide for oneself, was by and large more healthy than being dependent on somebody else providing that for one. Now here again, we're speaking to an audience, a human audience, of devotees that has a very wide spectrum, and we cannot make one statement that embraces all. So they're talking in generalities here. There are always exceptions, but generally, the necessity for being active is universal for everybody. We have to even it takes a lot of energy to be able to totally give oneself to God and to see God providing for everything that all of our needs are. And when Swami lived in the ashram and in Los Angeles afterwards, he said what happens is this total non-possession makes us dependent, the average aspirant, not upon God, but we become dependent on those people who are going to provide for us, or the institution that's going to provide for us. And so that intermediary dependence upon that, he felt wasn't absolutely healthy for everybody. And some people, within them, it stimulates a feeling of oppression rather than freedom. In other words, when you have a sense of lack and you have no avenue by which you can satisfy that sense of lack, you begin to feel oppressed. And then you don't like that sense of oppression. You want something, but there's no way for you to fulfill that. And you feel uncomfortable, so you begin to, from that oppression, you begin to suppress that, oh, that's not a good idea. And without some outlet, you begin to inwardly, you suppress that sense of conflict that begins to arise within you. And Swami just said that's not good. You need to give people an avenue in some fashion to be responsible for their own welfare to some degree. Now, this varies on a person's status and situation in life. If you're living in a monastery and you have willingly taken up that vocation, then he felt, well, you should be given a monthly stipend. You could say an allowance. And that's what they did in Master's. That's what Master advocated in his ashram. Everybody got a certain allowance. And in a sense, in our ashrams and Ananda ashrams, we don't do that in Ananda village, but at our ashram in Assisi, that's somewhat of what they do. Everybody who's a member of that ashram, they get a monthly allowance, and is a salary. Uh, and many of the other things in their daily life are provided for. But that allowance gives a person a sense of ability to use it as they feel necessary, because no two persons' needs are exactly the same. And so it gives that sense of, a little bit of a sense of freedom comes in there. Now you could say that's a step down from the absolute of ideal of allowing God to provide for everything. And yes, that's so. But in the modern world, and for most devotees, that's important. It makes one more active rather than passive. And now Swami, he was a very practical man. Uh, uh, he said also that if you give people an opportunity to have some control over their individuals and decide for themselves, they tend to be more relaxed and natural, and they're not being dependent passively on anybody else. And it also, if there's some sense of freedom to provide for oneself, it stimulates courage and the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet. And it's much better when a person is able to give and to reach that point of being inwardly generous by their own initiative. So consequently, if you're a wealthy person and you don't, sometimes a poor person, assuming the poor person's a devotee, might accuse the wealthy person, well, look at all that money that you have, and perhaps there's a jealousy toward that. But which of the two is better? If it's the wealthy person who has accumulated resources and is generous and shares them with other people, versus the devotee who has very little and doesn't share anything. So consequently, the wealthy person has learned to be able to use his resources and overcome that attachment, and has stimulated or been given the opportunity to become generous, versus the person who lives the ideal of non-possession but yet is attached to what little possessions they have, you see. So consequently, a person who has lots of energy and generates a lot of resources, they can, of their own free will, learn to become generous. And Swamiji felt that a rule can never bring about spiritual development. Rules don't work. A person has to come to this through their own understanding. And if they don't have the opportunity to accumulate something, they're not going to learn the ability to be generous with what they've accomplished or what they've brought in. And it doesn't depend upon how much or the actual amount, but that ability to give something and be generous with what one does have is very important for us to learn to overcome that sense of attachment, and to learn the positive side, which is generosity. And then we have to have generosity of spirit, which is the real value. But we do that by learning to be generous with our possessions. And so he said poverty doesn't allow that, because poverty, sometimes you don't have anything. It's difficult to become generous, and it can stimulate a sense of attachment and neediness. And he gave a number of, Swamiji used to, he sort of encouraged all of us to keep a few suggestions in mind. And he would, I'll just like to share a few of those suggestions. He says, of course, above everything, we have to develop that attitude of trying to reinforce in our mind that everything, no matter if we're rich or if we're poor, have many things or few things, think all of it comes from God. Don't think any of it belongs to us. We're simply borrowing. Everything's on loan. Even these bodies that we have, they're simply on loan. And to try to use as a technique to always give back. That which has been loaned to us, we should always, we're using it, but let it flow through you to share with whatever comes to you in life with others. Now, a portion of it at least. And this, of course, is the ideal behind tithing. But no matter at what level, even the poor person, if the materially poor person, if you're given something, give a little bit back. Share it with your neighbor. Share it with somebody else. And Swamiji said some people like to give gifts. He says this is a good thing. If you're doing it not attached, many people give gifts. They give on a holiday. They'll give a birthday card or a Christmas card or a Diwali card or a Diwali gift. And then if they're not given a gift back, well, they write them off their gift giving list. That's not quite an ideal way to do this. But the ideal of giving, first you start with those people who are close to you and you share with them, and then you expand the horizon on that to learn to give freely to others as well. But again, Swami and Master both said, if we are given resources, we have wealth, he says we want to respect it. In other words, if God gives you wealth, show respect to it by being appropriate with what you do. You just don't want to give it away willy-nilly because there's karma attached to it. If you give, another person takes what you gives, and because of that ability that you've given that person, they do something evil with it, you share a little bit of responsibility for that. Even if you gave it in a free heart, nevertheless, you weren't showing respect for what you had. And so consequently, he says, give, but give responsibly. Don't just give haphazardly. But it is important to give. And so keep that in mind. So you show respect for what God has given to you. Just think of this. If you give somebody a gift and a child a gift, and they totally destroy the gift in the first 10 seconds and they use it inappropriately, well, you're not going to want to give back the second time, or you're going to give something much less value perhaps at second time. So it is with us, and God comes to us. Now, Swamiji would say too, he says, don't equate non-possession or simplicity with sloppiness or lack of attention. And some people, they take up the spiritual quest, and they think they don't have to attend to details anymore. That, of course, is no saint or spiritual master would acquiesce to that idea. That you have to, what you're given, you have to be responsible for and take care of it. And so, consequently, in terms of the manner of dress, in terms of that which you are given, your orderliness, take care of it, respect it, and don't be sloppy, is what Swami would say, or negligent in your duties. If you're given a car, you have to take care of that car, and so that's what he was saying. And if something does come to you, you have to be grateful and you have to show appreciation. Now, Swami had, here's something interesting that he used to say. He says, if you buy something, if you buy something, now what is it we do? And Master used to do this too. He said he would go in and he would negotiate the price. And they said they would sort of have a certain, and he said that to a degree. because it showed some respect that you were being respectful for the resources that you had. And so you pay respect to it by trying to get a good price in a good spirit. But as he would say, Swami would say, show consideration for the happiness of the seller. You see, people negotiate and they bicker and they don't consider the other person. They try to get them down to the lowest possible price. And is that the best thing to do? If it, you might say, is depriving the seller of a fair profit on seller has to live too. So he would say, be considerate of the person that's selling it. Now we don't always know the price, so we feel that we have to get the lowest price possible, and sometimes that little thought comes into mind. Oh, that fellow, he's no matter what the price, he's overcharging me. Well, we have to. I guess I don't know how to overcome that thought exactly, but the point was, Swami would say, consider any bargain that you're making, that there's your happiness is important, but the other person's happiness must be considered as well. And when it comes to gift giving, he says one of the very best gifts that we can give other people, even if we don't have material possessions, is to share our happiness with others. Because many people, they say, well, I don't have anything to give, so I'm not going to give anything. Well, it might be true materially, but we can always share something more than outward happiness. But the summation of this thing is to say, renunciation is not self deprivation, is an attitude that everything belongs to God, and that we're children of God, and God will provide for us, and to have faith in that. In the meantime, keep our lives simple. Now, why simple? Is because if we're devotees, our focus wants to be on God, seeing God in other people, seeing God in whatever comes to us, and keeping that attention there. And it doesn't have to be this way, but it realistically, for most people, it is when you invest our energy into fulfillment of desires, very little time is left for fulfilling that highest desire of all, which is desire for God. So to the degree, keep ourselves materially in a state of simplicity. We need a few things in life. Keep them clean, do well with them, give them respect, provide for the family in a simple way, show energy, expend energy, work, serve God. Material wealth comes, that's fine. Provide for yourself and your family, provide for your friends, and make it a habit to let that energy flow through you and back in service and sharing with God. And you'll find that your life will begin to work easily and harmoniously, and God will provide for you when the need arises. I've seen it in my own life. I've been very fortunate in that way. I've never had very much material things in life, but I've always had what I needed. When the time came, somehow it was provided. And I think you will find this to be the case too. God provides if we give our first attention to Him, and that'll be the natural consequence. So apply the principles here in your own life. Like I say, you can't make a firm and hard rule for any of this. It has to be done intuitively. And so I'm going to go and look at my question and answer box here. How to live with extravagance of your of your spouse when he doesn't consider it extravagance. We have to be non-attached even in those cases. I know what you're saying there, and that's a very interesting position to be into. I think we have to set the example in our own lives. Everybody has their own path to follow, and I think our example has to be the best teacher. Now, if you can live, maybe that extravagance makes you feel uncomfortable. Well, you don't have to indulge in it. Try to live in a state of simplicity that it's appropriate for you in your situation. And, uh, you know, that that's a tricky one. That's a tricky one because we have to make priorities in life. What's our spiritual life is our priority, but when we're living in the practically with other people, our family, harmony is a very high value. And Master and Swamiji always emphasize that. Make harmony your guide. And what does harmony require? It requires a mutual compromise with the situation around ourselves. A firm rule is never going to be the guiding light. We have to harmonize, a give and a take. And any marriage and relationship is also built on that harmony and compromise one with the other. So all I can say is do your best on that. And then the second question, perhaps more than poverty or being rich, is the feeling of content. Absolutely. I mean, that's really what I'm saying. The feeling of contentment. Yes, as you emphasize, simplicity is the key. And that's really what we're here. It's the sense you can be content with great riches. King Janaka, he was content and he had great riches. Or you can be the sadhu on the wayside who is absolutely in bliss and he's content too and has very nothing. And so that's the important point that we're all seeking. And how can one implement minimalistic living from a spiritual view? Minimalism is an interesting concept. And I tend to have a streak in myself toward that. But you have to remember, it's not the goal. It's a you might say it's a hobby. It's a side thing. It's a tool toward attaining something higher. And it's, you might say, a form of self-discipline, which I do think we do have to have some self-discipline in life. It's a reining in of those tendencies that can take us away from our goal, but it is a tool. It's not the goal. And so I think keep that in mind when you're practicing minimalism. But I like the thought. But there are higher goals also, and the highest goal, remember, is being in love with God and doing appropriate things. And sometimes you have to think of yourself as a servant of God, and sometimes, or like the servant of the king. The servant of the king has to dress according to what's going to please the king, not according to his own minimalistic feelings. And so sometimes you have to do or you should always do what's appropriate to the situation, no matter what it is your own personal wishes might be in that situation. So when we're in this world, we have to, again, harmony, compromise, appropriateness. But when you're by yourself, that's another matter. You're in control of those situations and you can live according to how you want to live. And the one final one, facing the challenges to receive the payments from the client from past 3 months. That, I assume the question in there is maybe that those payments are not coming and you're stuck with it. Well, that's a little bit of a different question, and how to answer that. Maybe I would leave that for another day. So I'm sorry, I won't go there. Uh, so thank you all for coming this week again, and I hope to see you all again next Monday. And if you, again, like I always say it almost every time, if you have suggestions for topics, please send them in to Bara, and he'll pass them along to me, and I'll try to get to them at one time or another. And as we go, I didn't have a chance to really answer all of these questions appropriately because I spoke a little too long, maybe. But we'll have one of these question and answer sessions that'll for the whole time after a few weeks. So joy to you, and may you have a blessed week ahead. God bless.